In the late autumn of 36 BC, deep in the heart of Central Asia, on the banks of the Talas River, an expeditionary force of more than 40,000 men has arrived. It is now less than 2 kilometers from Zhizhi city, the last stronghold of the Xiongnu Chanyu Zhizhi. Soldiers drop their baggage, erect fortified camps, and crossbowmen move into position. The autumn wind is bleak. Banners of black and red stream in the air. This is the army of the Han Empire, appearing for the very first time on this land, fully 4,000 kilometers from the imperial capital of Chang'an. Zhizhi city is completely unlike any Xiongnu stronghold the Han army has encountered before. The city is protected by 2 layers of defenses. The outer line is a wooden palisade made of thick logs arranged into a barrier that can both block cavalry charges and provide covering fire for the defenders. The inner line is a wall of rammed earth, the final core of the defense. Between the 2 lines there is open ground, allowing the garrison to fall back to the inner citadel if the outer wall is breached. Inside the city, there is no sign of surrender. Banners already crowd the walls. Hundreds of armored defenders stand upon them, bows and weapons trained on the ground below. Just as Han commander Chen Tang is still studying this defensive network, which looks nothing like the work of nomads, the city gates suddenly swing open. More than 100 Xiongnu cavalrymen pour out and ride back and forth in front of the Han lines. They do not charge immediately. Instead, they repeatedly approach, then wheel away, trying to observe the Han deployment. This is a standard tactic of Xiongnu light cavalry. There is nothing surprising about it. But behind the Xiongnu horsemen, another force is slowly emerging from the gate. It is a body of infantry, more than 100 strong. They do not scatter like steppe horsemen. They do not seek individual positions. Instead, they press tightly together, rank upon rank linking up, the whole unit arrayed in a formation that resembles overlapping fish scales. Right between the 2 armies, they repeatedly change formation with synchronized movements, utterly unshaken by the vast enemy host outside the city. The crossbowmen in the Han lines begin to draw their weapons. The Book of Han would later call this a fish scale formation. The history does not say what country these infantrymen came from, nor does it describe their shields and weapons in detail. Yet, in research carried out 2,000 years later, these 100-odd men would be linked once again to a war fought far away in the west. Some believe they might have been Roman soldiers captured by the Parthian Empire after the Battle of Carrhae, men who had been moved and traded across the continent, finally washing up in Central Asia to serve as mercenary professionals in the employ of Chanyu Zhizhi. They could not, of course, have been a complete Roman legion. There was no legionary eagle here, no orders from the Senate. They must have been a band of veterans, far from their homeland for many years. The allegiance they now owed was not to Rome, but to the Xiongnu Chanyu inside this city. And it is worth noting that the Han imperial army outside the walls is itself a patchwork of origins. To begin with, this is no imperially sanctioned campaign at all, but a surprise assault launched by a frontier general acting on his own authority, forging orders in the emperor's name. Only a fraction of this 40,000-strong army consists of regular Han troops. The vast majority are soldiers from the various kingdoms of the western regions, and quite possibly Xiongnu, who had previously submitted to the Han. Yes, this is a confrontation that seems utterly filled with improbabilities and accidents. It is not only the single recorded instance of possible military contact between the 2 great systems of Rome and Han, but the circumstances, the significance, and the impact on later history would all profoundly alter the course of Asian history. Now the cavalry in front of the gates press forward once more. The Han crossbowmen have raised their weapons, taking aim at them. The strange infantry, arrayed like fish scales, still stand on either side of the gate. An unthinkable battle is about to erupt. The fortress of Zhizhi had a very short history. It was the last stronghold of the Zhizhi Chanyu, who had fled into Central Asia. Yet it was also his greatest hope of reviving Xiongnu power. After years of relentless Han attacks and natural disasters, the Xiongnu had fragmented and endured years of civil war. At the worst moment, 5 separate leaders on the steppe all simultaneously claimed the title of Chanyu. After successive consolidation, only 2 factions remained, Han and Zhizhi. Han gradually lost the upper hand in the contest and could only lead his followers into the Han frontier, submitting to the emperor as a vassal. Relying on grain and protection supplied by the Han court, he returned to the steppe and gathered his scattered population again. His elder brother, Chanyu Zhizhi, refused to accept this outcome. He defeated the other contenders, took control of the western Xiongnu, and then continued to push westward, bringing his followers deep into Central Asia. At this time, the Central Asian kingdom of Kangju was at war with its neighbors and sought an alliance with the Xiongnu, so they invited Chanyu Zhizhi and his people onto their territory. The once mighty Xiongnu, though defeated by the Han, were more than a match for the small states of Central Asia. Zhizhi quickly carved out a new domain for himself. After that, using brutal methods that included the massacre of hundreds of Kangju nobles, he coerced the kingdom into building him a solid fortress near the present-day Talas River. This was Zhizhi City. Using Zhizhi City as his base, the Xiongnu Chanyu extorted tribute from nearby states and murdered Han envoys, as if the old dominance of the steppe lords had returned. But in fact, this was a decision that went against the fundamental strategic logic of the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu's greatest advantage against the Han had always been their strategic mobility as nomads. The Han army might win set-piece battles, but it could never envelop, pursue, or utterly annihilate the Xiongnu forces, which kept the Han in a permanent strategic defensive posture. The few decisive Han victories had all been extremely costly, high-risk campaigns led by commanders of rare genius. And now, Chanyu Zhizhi had chosen to build a fixed city, effectively creating a stationary target. Could this be justified? Actually, from Zhizhi's perspective, it was a carefully calculated gamble. First, his Xiongnu followers were far from their homeland and had suffered heavy losses fighting as mercenaries. They urgently needed a base to rest and recover. Second, the relative weakness of the Central Asian states had ignited his ambition. He dreamed of using Zhizhi City as a fulcrum to build an entirely new empire in Central Asia and restore Xiongnu glory. Third, and most importantly, the location was brilliantly chosen. It was 4,000 kilometers from Chang'an. To put that in perspective, it is roughly the distance from Rome all the way to Western India, or driving from New York City down to Colombia in South America. In the agrarian age, this was far beyond the reach of any feasible military strike. And distance was not even the most critical factor. Those 4,000 kilometers were filled with nearly impassable barriers. Heading west from Chang'an, the moment a Han army left the plains of the Central Plain, it would face a logistical nightmare. Even in the He corridor, which the Han firmly controlled, the army had to depend entirely on a chain of oases just to move and resupply. Leaving Dunhuang, the last of the great oases, meant leaving the civilized world and entering the Sea of Death, the Taklamakan, the world's largest shifting sand desert. The army could only creep along the northern or southern rim of the desert, clinging to small, scattered oases. The marches between these oases could take days, sometimes weeks. Starvation, thirst, and a total lack of supplies were ever-present threats. Worse, the carrying capacity of these oases was extraordinarily limited. A large army would rapidly exhaust its resources, forcing it to carry gigantic supply trains that required even more manpower, creating a vicious cycle.
If, by some miracle, the Han army emerged from the desert without catastrophic losses,
It would then face the next geographical limit, the Pamir Mountains. The average elevation of the Pamirs is over 4,000 meters. Even today, it stands as a colossal barrier between China and Central Asia. Altitude sickness, extreme temperature swings, and geological hazards would be almost insurmountable obstacles. An army marching from Chang'an that managed to cross the Pamirs with even half of its strength intact would be an unparalleled feat. In truth, during an earlier campaign against the kingdom of Dayuan in the Fergana Valley, a Han expedition of tens of thousands ended up with only a few thousand men returning home. So, given the technology of the time, a strike against Zhizhi City, located in what is now Kazakhstan, launched from Chang'an, was practically a fantasy. But then an unexpected variable appeared, a man who was equal parts genius and villain, the commander Chen Tang. Let us briefly review the first half of Chen Tang's life. Unlike many of the great Han generals from noble maternal clans of earlier reigns, Chen Tang was a penniless commoner. In fact, so destitute was he as a young man that he often survived by borrowing money and begging, and he was frequently humiliated by his neighbors for failing to repay his debts. Yet he had been erudite and studious from a young age, amassing a profound body of knowledge. Eventually, he made his way to the capital, Chang'an, seeking an official appointment. With great difficulty, he gained the favor of a marquis who recommended him to the court. But at that very moment, his father died. By law, he was required to return home to observe the mourning period. Unwilling to lose this rare chance, Chen Tang concealed the news of his father's death. When the truth came to light, he was stripped of his office and thrown in prison. Later, he was released under a general amnesty and, after further ups and downs, was finally appointed as the deputy colonel of the Protectorate of the Western Regions. A man like this was bound to possess astonishing talent, an iron will, and a burning ambition. The Book of Han says he was calm and daring, skilled in strategy, yet fond of achieving extraordinary feats of merit. Whenever he came to a city or a stretch of mountainous terrain, he would climb to a high vantage point to survey the surrounding roads. How the walls were built, in which direction the water sources lay, where an army could pass through. These details that seemed trivial to others were the very basis on which he determined whether a war could be waged. In 36 BC, when Chen Tang learned the exact location of Zhizhi City, he could barely contain his wild joy and began trying to persuade his superior, the Protector General of the Western Regions, to launch an attack. The Protector General's question was practical. Where will the troops come from? What about provisions and fodder? Chen Tang's plan was revolutionary. He proposed mobilizing the Han garrison troops already stationed in the Western regions for military agricultural colonies, then using the authority of the Protectorate to levy soldiers from the various vassal states and allies. This would avoid the lengthy process of waiting for troops from the capital and solve the problem of extended supply lines. At the time, the Han garrison in the Western regions likely numbered less than 20,000. Considering combat ratios and the need to leave behind a rearguard, the actual Han expeditionary force could have been at most 10,000 men. But these were battle-hardened frontier troops, well-trained and already acclimatized to the local environment. Their equipment gave them an overwhelming edge. Full suits of lamellar armor, ring pommel sabers, long halberds, and, most formidably, the powerful Han crossbow. Each cavalryman had at least 3 horses. According to historical records, a single, fully armed Han soldier was roughly a match for 10 nomadic warriors. This was, in effect, a special forces unit. The vassal states would provide auxiliary troops, primarily light cavalry and horse archers, as well as logistical support. The problem was, will the emperor approve? The Protector General thought the plan was viable, but he wanted to report it to the imperial court first and await permission. Chen Tang, desperate for merit and glory, panicked. For a message to reach Chang'an and a reply to return would take half a year. The window of opportunity was fleeting. There was only one way: to forge an imperial edict. While his superior was still hesitating, Chen Tang had already raised more than 40,000 soldiers in the emperor's name. Then, sword in hand, he confronted his superior. "The arrow is already on the string," he declared. "The army is about to march. Do you intend to stop them single-handed?" To rescind the orders at this point would not only cause the Han to lose face before all the kingdoms of the western regions, but could also instantly plunge the already assembled army into chaos. His superior had no choice but to accept the fait accompli. Chen Tang immediately organized the force into 6 columns and sent a memorial to the court, confessing that the orders were forged. Thus, a war to strike deep into Central Asia, storm a city, and kill the Xiongnu Chanyu was launched by a mere deputy commander of a regional military zone. No imperial approval, no court-provisioned grain, no massive armies transferred from the interior. If Chen Tang failed, what awaited him would not simply be military defeat, but the charges of forging an imperial edict, mobilizing troops without authorization, and starting a war on his own. You can imagine a similar scenario. A US combatant commander receives intelligence on the location of a terrorist group's leader. Without any authorization, he forges orders, mobilizes Rangers and Delta Force operators from an overseas base, and, with help from local allies, invades a nominally neutral third country to carry out a decapitation strike. Yes, the Han Empire did exactly that 2,000 years ago, relying solely on a deputy colonel and his verbal command. Orders can be forged, but an army cannot materialize out of thin air. The Book of Han records that Chen Tang assembled more than 40,000 troops, Han and barbarian combined. This phrase is often simplified into 40,000 Han troops, but the Han Dynasty simply did not have that many native soldiers in the western regions at the time. The agricultural garrison outposts in the region normally had only a limited number of officers and men. Even if all garrisons and military colonists were concentrated, the Han soldiers who could actually join the expedition might have numbered only a few thousand. They were familiar with Han military commands, equipped with powerful crossbows, shields, and long weapons, and shouldered the tasks of command, camp defense, siege warfare, and holding the line. They were the backbone of the entire army, but they could not have formed the bulk of the 40,000. The majority of the troops came from the various kingdoms of the western regions. Using the forged edict, Chen Tang demanded that the city-states under Han control send soldiers. These troops were still commanded by their own rulers and included infantry, archers, and light cavalry suitable for long-distance marches. The Han ally Wusun, which had fought the Xiongnu for generations, had even more direct reason to join the war and thus likely provided a substantial number of horsemen. There may have been yet another force in the expeditionary army, Xiongnu, who had already submitted to the Han. Long before Chanyu Hu Hanye threw in his lot with the Han, many Xiongnu who had surrendered were settled along the empire's northern frontier, where they were known as tributary cavalry. There are records of them being conscripted to fight in many Western region campaigns. The participation of some surrendered Xiongnu horsemen in the expedition was entirely plausible in terms of both political interests and military conditions. Therefore, the army marching on Zhizhi city was not 40,000 Han Chinese infantry from the interior, but a hastily assembled multi-ethnic coalition. The Han military colonists provided the crossbowmen, the siege capacity, and the command backbone. The western region states supplied large numbers of local troops, and Wusun, along with any participating surrendered Xiongnu, formed the main cavalry force. The army set out from the protectorate of the western regions, which, compared to a journey from Chang'an, cut the distance in half. But the desert was still there. The Pamir Plateau and the snow-capped mountains were still there. Whether 40,000 men could reach their destination swiftly and safely remained fraught with overwhelming uncertainty. Chen Tang divided the coalition army of over 40,000 into 6 columns. 3 of them advanced westward along the southern side of the Tian Shan Mountains. The other 3, which he personally led, entered Wusun north of the Tian Shan Range, then crossed the steppe towards Kangju. The 2 forces were separated by mountain ranges and desert and could not communicate at will, but this arrangement eased the pressure of provisioning along the route and made it impossible for Zhizhi to tell from which direction the Han army would appear. Chen Tang was not carrying the reserves needed for a protracted war. He had to rely on the garrison granaries, food supplied by the western region states, and livestock captured en route to complete the march. If just one column got lost in the mountains, or a single city-state refused to open its gates, the entire expedition could end before it even reached Zhizhi city. After entering Wusun, the northern army continued to push into Kangju. Kangju was not a land entirely loyal to Zhizhi. Zhizhi had initially been invited by the Kangju royal house and was placed on the eastern frontier to fight the Wusun. Once he established himself, however, he began murdering Kangju nobles, forcing the local population to build his city, and even had the Kangju king's daughter and hundreds of her attendants thrown into a river. Some Kangju still provided him with troops. Others were already waiting for a chance to be rid of him. Once inside Kangju, Chen Tang did not allow his troops to loot along the way. He secretly contacted a Kangju nobleman who bore a grudge against Zhizhi, and from him obtained details about the city's location, the size of its garrison, and its internal dynamics. Before Zhizhi had even laid eyes on the Han army, his own enemies within Kangju were already guiding Chen Tang. But Kangju was not monolithic. Many people there remained loyal to the Xiongnu. The coalition's rear was soon attacked. Several thousand Kangju horsemen bypassed the main force, struck the baggage train, killed and captured a number of personnel, and made off with a large quantity of livestock. This might well have forced the expedition to halt. Chen Tang did not recall the Han infantry responsible for the order of march. Instead, he unleashed the barbarian troops within his ranks to pursue. The western region and steppe cavalry rapidly caught up with the enemy, killing several hundred of them and recapturing the abducted people and most of the livestock. This brief engagement demonstrated that the various ethnic troops Chen Tang had brought already had a clear division of labor. The Han corps controlled the camp and the baggage, while the cavalry, skilled in steppe warfare, was responsible for reconnaissance, counterattacks, and pursuit. After several months of marching, the two forces finally converged within Kangju and then continued their advance towards Zhizhi city. Chen Tang first encamped 60 li from the city. The next day, he advanced to 30 li and sent men to observe the roads and the defenders' movements. Zhizhi had by now received word but remained deeply confused. The Han Emperor had made no open declaration of war, and no envoy had brought a formal edict. To travel the thousands of li from Chang'an to this place, what kind of divine power could have delivered such a Han imperial host to the heart of Kangju? In his shock, Zhizhi Chanyu's advisors urged him to flee immediately, but he feared that if he left the city with only a small escort, he would be ambushed by the Kangju who resented him. He decided to make a stand, gambling that the Han army, having come so far, would run out of supplies. To that end, he even sent an envoy to the approaching Han army to sue for peace, offering to send his own son to Chang'an as a hostage. But no one could trust a man who had just murdered Han envoys, least of all Chen Tang, who had victory within his grasp and was thirsting for glory. He coldly replied, The Son of Heaven has heard that the Chanyu is living in this remote, desolate place, and was worried you might be uncomfortable. He has specially sent us to welcome you and your family back. The reason we haven't entered the city yet is that we feared startling you. After the envoy returned, Zhizhi sent livestock as gifts, continuing to probe. The two sides exchanged several messages, neither believing the other. While receiving these communiques, Chen Tang moved his camp forward, finally halting at a position roughly 2 kilometers from the city walls. At this stage, negotiations were meaningless. The battle finally began. It was then that the century of troops drilled in the fish-scale formation made their appearance. But given their numbers, they could not possibly influence the outcome of the battle. And indeed, Chen Tang simply ordered his crossbowmen to unleash a volley. The 100-odd infantry and cavalry immediately retreated back inside the city. What may have been the closest historical encounter between Han troops and Roman soldiers probably lasted only a very short time. The two sides did not deploy for a pitched battle in the open field, nor did the infantry launch a coordinated advance against the Han lines. The real fight they would take part in was about to unfold between the gates, the wooden palisade, and the earthen walls. Chen Tang immediately ordered the city to be surrounded on all sides, trenches to be dug, and every exit to be sealed off. Though the 40,000-strong coalition was numerically large, those who could truly carry the brunt of a frontal assault were primarily the Han military colonists. These men had been stationed in the western regions for years. They had to farm, but also build fortifications, guard warehouses, and protect the roads. They were expert in coordinating shields, long halberds, and powerful crossbows, and they were far better suited than the allied cavalry to hold formation in the narrow killing ground beneath the city walls. As the assault began, shield-bearers went forward, with halberdiers and crossbowmen following behind. Crossbow bolts arced over the shields to suppress the archers on the walls, while the infantry gradually closed in on the outer defensive line. In some ways, Zhizhi city's defensive system resembled a fusion of Central Asian design and Roman military engineering. Inside the city was a main wall of rammed earth, while outside it stood an encircling wooden palisade. The defenders sheltered behind this timber wall to shoot. As the Han troops approached, they were repeatedly struck by arrows. Chen Tang did not order his men to launch repeated suicidal frontal attacks. Instead, he instructed the various units to gather brushwood and grass, pile it near the wooden wall, and set it ablaze. The flames spread along the palisade, forcing the defenders to pull back from their outer line. That night, several hundred cavalry suddenly burst from the city, attempting to break through the encirclement. The crossbowmen waiting outside concentrated their fire, and the majority of the breakout force fell between the trenches and the besieging camps. Beyond the city, there was an even larger relief force. Around 10,000 Kangju horsemen, scattered outside the siege lines, made repeated approaches to the Han camp under cover of darkness. They feinted at one point, then swerved towards another, hoping to force Chen Tang to divide his forces and open an escape corridor for Zhizhi. Yet these cavalrymen never managed to concentrate for a decisive charge. Chen Tang's army included vast numbers of Wusun, western region, and possibly surrendered Xiongnu horsemen, who could engage the enemy without pulling the assault infantry away from the siege. Every time the Kangju approached, they were driven back by the coalition cavalry and the crossbowmen in the camp. The defenders inside the city could see their allies outside, but they waited in vain for them to break through the encirclement. The fighting continued all through the night. The wooden palisade kept burning. Arrows flew back and forth from the earthen walls. Zhizhi himself mounted the gate tower to direct the defense, flanked by dozens of his wives, concubines, and close ministers, who also picked up bows and shot at the attackers. He was soon hit by an arrow and withdrew deeper into the city. The defense of the gate tower did not stop because of this, But the defenders had already lost their outer wooden wall, and the breakout attempt had failed. When daylight came, Chen Tang ordered the drums to be beaten on all four sides simultaneously. The Han shield-bearers pushed forward once again, the crossbowmen continued to shoot, and troops from the western regions poured in through the gaps where the palisade had already burned down. Fires were breaking out everywhere in the city, and the defenders were being compressed into the space between the earthen walls and the interior buildings. Zhizhi led the remnants of his followers in continued resistance, and finally fell in the chaotic melee. His severed head was cut off by a Han soldier and brought before Chen Tang. During the search of the city, the expeditionary force also found the tally tokens and official documents of the slain Han envoys. Every justification Chen Tang had given for launching the war was now fully confirmed. A post-battle tally recorded that the Han army had killed more than 1,500 of Zhizhi's relatives, nobles, and garrison troops, captured 145 prisoners, and accepted the surrender of over 1,000 others. The possibility that Roman soldiers took part in the Battle of Zhizhi city traces back to the Battle of Carrhae, fought 17 years earlier. The year 53 BC was one of shame for Rome. In the desert near present-day Harran in Turkey, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the first triumvirate of the Roman Republic and the man famous for crushing the Spartacus uprising, marched his 7 legions, more than 40,000 elite Roman soldiers, straight into a death trap. It was an unnecessary eastern campaign, launched by Crassus entirely for personal military glory. A Parthian general with merely 10,000 horsemen launched the attack on the Roman army. Though the ratio was 4-1, this Parthian force, composed of 9,000 horse archers and 1,000 cataphracts, employed the famous Parthian shot tactic. With an unceasing, sky-darkening hail of arrows and nimble mobility, they constantly harassed the Roman heavy infantry squares, wiping out their auxiliary units. When the Romans were finally exhausted by the scorching sun and desperate thirst, the Parthian cataphracts delivered a devastating charge. The Roman formation collapsed. Of the 40,000 Roman soldiers, 20,000 were killed, 10,000 fled westward, and 10,000 were taken prisoner. Crassus himself was killed during negotiations. It was one of the most catastrophic military defeats in Roman history. The legionary eagles, symbols of military honor, were captured by the Parthians. Revenge against Parthia would remain a Roman political slogan for the next century. This semi-nomadic empire, ruled by nomads but built upon the ruins of the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire, would lock horns with Rome repeatedly for the next 300 years, becoming its principal eastern rival. And this Parthian Empire is recorded in Chinese historical texts as Angji. As early as the reign of Emperor Wu of Han, diplomatic relations had been established between the two. The famous Silk Road was, in essence, a trade route from Han territory to Angji and from Angji to Rome. The Parthian Empire tightly controlled the overland trade routes from the Iranian plateau to Mesopotamia. Chinese silks, ironware, and other goods had to pass through Parthian merchants to reach Rome, their prices multiplied several times over. Likewise, Roman glassware, gemstones, and spices were imported into China through Angji, from which Angji earned enormous middleman profits. According to records, the eastern frontier of the Parthian Empire stretched from the Caspian coast of present-day Turkmenistan, southeast along the borders that Afghanistan shares with Iran and Turkmenistan, and finally southward into the vast region west of the Hindu Kush. On this frontier, one oasis was particularly crucial, the Merv oasis, site of the ancient city of Merv, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This isolated, fertile, and precious oasis was a crossroads connecting the Iranian plateau, the mountains of Afghanistan, the Indian subcontinent, and the vast northern steppe. According to the 1st century Roman writer, naturalist, and military officer Pliny the Elder, in his work Natural History. The Parthian Empire settled Roman legionaries captured at the Battle of Carrhae in the province of Margiana, and the capital of Margiana was Merv. The contemporary Roman poet Horace mocked them in one of his odes. The soldiers of Crassus live on, husbands of shameful barbarian wives, serving their father-in-law king. In other words, the surviving Roman legionaries from Carrhae were stationed at Merv to guard the Parthian Empire's eastern frontier. This is conclusive evidence that Roman soldiers had indeed appeared in Central Asia. Indeed, simple logic points to the same conclusion. The Roman-Parthian wars lasted 300 years, and just over a decade after Crassus's defeat, Mark Antony would launch another massive campaign against Parthia. The Parthians could never have placed such an unstable element on their western frontier. The East, Central Asia, was the only possible destination for this lost Roman legion. Further east from eastern Parthia lay the Central Asian regions where the Sogdians and Kangju were active. This was not an uncrossable void. Merchants, envoys, prisoners of war and mercenaries had long moved along the oases and steppes. It was not uncommon for a man to be captured in one war, conscripted into an army, and then taken in by another power in the next conflict. Roman soldiers who were in their early 20s at the time of Carrhae would still have been only around 40 years old at the Battle of Zhizhi city, perfectly capable of continuing to serve. Zhizhi also had the conditions to employ soldiers of this kind. He controlled a fortress that had taken 2 years to build, could extort goods from nearby states, and had been at war for a long time with Wusun, Kangju, and other Central Asian powers. For a steppe ruler chronically short of reliable infantry, a small team of foreign veterans, skilled in dense formations and gate defense, would have been of immense value. They did not need to be numerous. A few dozen to 100+ men would have been enough to form an independent gate guard unit. The record of this infantry in the Book of Han is indeed unusual. The court historian specifically noted the infantry's fish-scale formation flanking the gate. This indicates that their style was unfamiliar compared to the steppe warfare the Han soldiers knew. Their ranks were orderly and dense, leaving an impression on those who witnessed them. If they had been ordinary Xiongnu or Kangju soldiers, the history might not have needed to describe them separately. Thus, the idea of scattered Roman soldiers appearing as mercenaries in Zhizhi city is not a groundless fantasy. The Carrhae captives certainly existed, and their movement eastward is geographically plausible. Zhizhi needed professional infantry, and right in front of the gate, there just happened to appear a unit of limited numbers and highly unusual formation. No single clue can prove on its own that they came from Rome, but the convergence of these conditions makes the possibility worth taking seriously. The problem is that later accounts repeatedly expanded on this conjecture, eventually turning 100-odd unidentified infantrymen into a full Roman legion. To date, no artifacts have been discovered that can be directly linked to the Roman military. No Latin writing, no legionary insignia, no Roman weapons that can be securely dated, no graves that can be confirmed as belonging to Mediterranean migrants. Another, even more widely circulated theory connects the captives of Zhizhi city with the settlement of Liqian in the He corridor. According to this hypothesis, after capturing the fish-scale infantry, Chen Tang brought them back to Han territory and resettled them in what is now Gansu province. It is claimed that these Romans lived in Liqian for 2 millennia, leaving behind graves containing skeletons of unusually large stature, and that the present-day villages still exhibit European physical features. This theory has even more problems. First, the county of Liqian already existed before the Battle of Zhizhi city, and could not have been established by the Han Dynasty to settle prisoners from that war. Second, the Book of Han explicitly records that the 145 captives and more than 1,000 who surrendered at Zhizhi city were distributed among the 15 Western region kingdoms that joined the campaign. There is no mention of Chen Tang bringing a group of them back to the He corridor. More importantly, recent DNA testing of the people of Liqian has overturned this theory. While they do indeed have some Central Asian ancestry, genetically they are not significantly different from other Chinese populations. No specific Roman genetic markers have been found. Western sinologists often find it difficult to grasp the sheer brutality of ancient Chinese history. Recurring cycles of natural disasters, warfare, and dynastic change continually dealt devastating blows to the population, sometimes reducing it by 80 to 90%. The idea that a village could maintain a unique bloodline for 2,000 years is, in the context of Chinese history, almost a fairy tale. Even if Roman captives were indeed once settled in China, their bloodline would long ago have been diluted and forgotten in the upheavals of 2,000 years. Only by obtaining ancient DNA from remains dating to the 1st century BC, or by discovering Latin inscriptions, Roman military equipment, or coins of confirmed provenance, could Liqian be truly linked to Roman prisoners of war. For now, none of this evidence has surfaced. The Roman mercenaries might have been real. A Roman legionary expedition against the Han Dynasty is a fiction. As for Liqian as a city of Roman captives, it is more like a legend that has steadily expanded in the gaps between historical sources.
Of course, the most important consequence of the Battle of Zhizhi's city is not whether Roman soldiers took part, but its impact on the course of Asian and especially Central Asian history. After Zhizhi's head was brought back to the Han Empire, the Xiongnu civil war that had dragged on for years finally lost its last competing center of power. Chanyu Huhanye entered the Han frontier. He accepted Han titles and grain, and, relying on Han military protection, he returned to the steppe, where the previously scattered Xiongnu population gradually returned to his fold. But this recovery was incomplete. As long as Zhizhi still existed, the Xiongnu still had 2 Chanyus. Any tribe dissatisfied with Huhanye could simply head west and join his rival. Any Xiongnu noble wishing to throw off Han influence could also restart the war in the name of Zhizhi. After Zhizhi city was stormed, this path vanished. Zhizhi himself, his heirs, and the chief nobles around him were mostly killed in the fighting. The regime of the Western Chanyu collapsed with them. In political terms, the Xiongnu once again had a single Chanyu. The steppe polity that had been divided for over a decade was once more united under Huhanye's line. But this unification was different from those before. Huhanye had not defeated his last rival with his own army. A deputy frontier commander of the Han Dynasty had forged an order, mobilized the entire military strength of the western regions, and pushed deep into Central Asia to kill Zhizhi on his behalf. The Han did not annex the Xiongnu, nor did they directly administer the steppe. Yet, through control of grain, the frontier, and military aid, they decided who could continue to be the Chanyu. Huhanye regained his full political status, but at the same time, he was more dependent on the Han than ever. When he learned that Zhizhi had been killed, the history books record only 4 Chinese characters for his reaction, both joyful and fearful. His joy came from the disappearance of his last rival. The followers who had once served Zhizhi now had no other Chanyu to turn to. His fear came from the operational capability the Han army had just demonstrated. Zhizhi had retreated deep into Central Asia, hiding in a fortress inside Kangju that he had spent years building, and yet he was still found and killed by a hastily assembled expeditionary force. Huhanye knew better than anyone that if he himself were to become an enemy of the Han again, the steppe and distance might not be enough to protect him. Not long after Zhizhi's death, Hu Hanye requested another audience in Chang'an. He accepted gifts and honors at the Han capital and requested to establish a marriage alliance with the imperial house. Emperor Yuan of Han ultimately gave him a palace lady named Wang Qiang in marriage. This woman, who would later be known as Wang Zhaojun, returned to the steppe with Hu Hanye, transforming the alliance between the two sides from one of military dependence into a marriage bond. Hu Hanye subsequently offered to lead the Xiongnu in guarding the Han northern frontier, ensuring that the roads from the Great Wall all the way to Dunhuang would no longer be raided. The Han court did not dismantle its border fortifications or cease garrisoning them, but large-scale warfare did temporarily end. From the time Zhizhi was killed until decades later, when Wang Mang altered Han policy towards the Xiongnu, the two sides would not engage in another prolonged conflict of equal scale. As one film title puts it, all was quiet on the Western Front.
Finally, let us look at the personal fates of the characters in this story. The career of Deputy Colonel Chen Tang, who forged the imperial edict and won the Battle of Zhizhi city, was anything but smooth after his return. On the one hand, his victory was acknowledged by the emperor, and he was granted a noble rank. On the other hand, the civil bureaucracy, led by Confucian officials, incessantly attacked him for his personal corruption and his brazen contempt for the system. They pressured the emperor, and in the end, his reward was whittled down to a non-hereditary title and a low-ranking military post. At the height of his fame, Chen Tang once recommended a young man to the court, Wang Mang. In theory, Chen Tang, who came from a commoner background, should not have been able to make the acquaintance of the empress's nephew. Thus, we have every reason to believe that Chen Tang either wanted to curry favor with the Wang family, who then dominated the court, or that he accepted a massive bribe. Later, Chen Tang's greed and ambition led him into yet another blunder. The civil officials opened fire with all their guns, and he was ultimately stripped of his rank and thrown in prison. At this critical juncture, it was his extraordinary military talent that saved him. A succeeding emperor, valuing his ability, reinstated him. Chen Tang's career rose and fell several more times. He was even exiled to the frontier to guard the very Yumen Pass. The local officials pleaded for him in a delicately worded appeal. Chen Tang's reputation inspires awe far and wide, and the kingdoms of the western regions all fear and respect him. To place him so close to them harms our nation's international prestige. Please transfer him back to the interior. The emperor, finally recalling Chen Tang's past merits, allowed this hero of Zhizhi to return to the capital. A few years later, Chen Tang died of illness, still without office or title, as impoverished as he had been before he ever entered official life. Several years after that, the young man he had once recommended, Wang Mang, became Grand Marshal, monopolizing the reins of government, and began his unstoppable path to usurpation. He shattered the 40-year peace and reignited war with the Xiongnu. To shape public opinion in line with his own military and diplomatic ambitions, he dusted off a useful symbol, the hero who had once recommended him to the court. He posthumously bestowed upon the long-deceased Chen Tang a resplendent posthumous title and had his son inherit a full marquisate. In the memorial he presented to the emperor, Chen Tang wrote a line that would thunder down through the ages. "Those who dare to offend the mighty Han, though distant, shall be struck down." It was a lucid interpretation of the political significance of his own expedition, but it was too sharp, too radical, and thoroughly at odds with the increasingly conservative foreign policies of later Chinese dynasties. Consequently, with very few exceptions, this phrase was almost never promoted by the ruling classes. Even in China today, it mostly lies quietly in the pages of history books. But on the internet, a new generation has begun to quote this line and to retell Chen Tang's story. Why?
This is the most frustrating, yet also the most fascinating thing about history. It holds so many possibilities, so many facets. The history we read often depends on the angle from which we view it, on what we are looking for.